Now more than ever, we have to think about those who do not come to church, and those who are on the fringes of our church communities but are wary of closer involvement. Lockdown has given rise to two important groups of people. One group is the newly de-churched. When we closed our doors and suspended congregational worship, this group didn't Zoom to be part of our online presence. They didn't come streaming to our YouTube channel. And they didn't follow us or like us on Facebook. They just found other things to do on a Sunday morning. They got out of the habit of coming to church. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we reconnect with them? How do we welcome them back into church? How do we reassure them of God's love? And then there are those who I would best describe as our digital fringe. A Tearfund survey found that a quarter of adults in the UK have watched or listened to a religious service since the coronavirus lockdown began, and 1 in 20 have started praying during the crisis. Now, many of these are people that we have not had contact with before, so we have to ask ourselves, how do we connect with them? How do we welcome them to church? And we have to be honest, that some people are wary of us. Maybe they think they're not smart enough or good enough or religious enough to really throw their lot in with this whole church thing. Maybe they're frightened that they'll be judged or looked down upon or rejected. And so we have to work all the harder to make them welcome, to reassure them that none of us have it all together, that we are, as Martin Luther said, merely beggars, not especially smart or good or religious. The account of the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15 features someone who probably didn't think that they were smart enough or right enough or good enough or religious enough. Someone who might have been frightened of being judged or looked down upon or rejected. But she was also desperate because her daughter was frighteningly ill. She was possessed by an unclean spirit. So she went in search of Jesus. Mark's account of this story tells us that Jesus at the time was exhausted from his work and desperately needed a rest. So he checked into a friend's house and had tucked himself away in a cool, quiet corner. As far as Jesus was concerned, this was not a day for preaching or for healing. No, this was a rest day, a chance to unwind. But all of a sudden, there's this woman kneeling at his feet, begging him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, she's a woman and a Gentile to boot. Jesus should not have even spoken to her. In those days, rabbis when in public, didn't even talk to female members of their own family. There were a group of them called the bruised and bleeding rabbis because every time they saw a woman, they closed their eyes with inevitable consequences. Jewish women back then were looked down upon by Jewish men, and this woman wasn't even Jewish. She was a foreigner, a Gentile. This woman's daughter had an unclean spirit, a demon, some kind of illness, and she wanted her to be healed. She comes to Jesus, perhaps because he was a known miracle worker. He'd done this kind of thing before. Maybe he would do it for her. But Jesus said to her, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus is saying that he wasn't sent to deal with the likes of her, a Canaanite woman. He was sent to Israel, to God's chosen people, to the Jews, and not to the Gentiles. Now, this may sound harsh, but Jesus was seeking an engagement. He wanted to go deeper. He wanted to relate to this woman in the totality of all that she was. The woman had come to Jesus because she had heard that he made sick people well again. But she didn't know who he was. She didn't know that he was the Messiah. But by Jesus saying, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, Jesus is building up a picture of who he is. He's been sent. He's been sent to Israel. He's been sent to redeem the lost. Jesus is telling her who he is. Now note her response. As she kneels before him, she addresses him as Sir, or more properly Lord. You see, she recognizes him as the Messiah. Already, this engagement is working, and she's getting to know who Jesus really is. But before that, Jesus does something a little unusual. Jesus calls her a dog. Now here's a blow to political correctness. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, calls this woman a dog. Quite reasonably, commentators have attempted a damage limitation exercise on this. Some say Jesus meant it in a diminutive sense, as though to be called a little dog or a puppy is somehow less offensive. Others say that Jesus said it with a smile, that it was part of a witty banter that went on between him and the Gentile woman, as if Jesus and the woman had joined the cast of some Middle Eastern sitcom. Is it too much to suggest that Jesus actually called her a dog? She has just interrupted his retreat, after all. She was a Gentile, a woman asking favours from a Jew. Every Jew at the time would have called Gentiles dogs, and every Gentile would have expected to hear that in the eyes of a Jew, even of the Messiah, that is what they were, a dog. Jesus is naming the elephant in the room, or the dog in the room. For what it's worth, I think Jesus did call this woman a dog. But I think he did so because he knew in this particular instance, it would bring about a deepening of the engagement. He wanted to relate to this woman in the totality of all that she was. Often God confronts us with our fears, names the elephant in our room, calls out our insecurities, not to make us feel worse, but in order that we might overcome them. This woman in our story was intelligent, she was resourceful, she was determined. Jesus could so easily have just granted her request. But if he did so, then nothing would have been achieved beyond the healing of her daughter. Instead, she's forced to reflect on why she's come. She comes to a point where she recognizes that this man, Jesus, is the Messiah of God, and she kneels down before him and calls him Lord. Then she's taken one stage further in her engagement with God. She believed when she set out that Jesus was just a wonder worker, who would either wave a magic wand and heal her daughter, or he would dismiss her. End of story. Having now discovered that he is the Messiah, the next question she must ask is, why would the Messiah, the Son of God, heal the daughter of someone like her, a woman, a Gentile, in his eyes maybe nothing more than a dog? And that's where she discovers faith. If her daughter was to be healed, then it wouldn't have been because she shouted at the disciples, or pleaded with their master, or even that she'd outsmarted them with her stunning wit and repartee. If her daughter was to be healed, then it would be because God's generous love extended to one such as her. She may be just a dog to some people. That's what she feared. But she believed, she had faith. She knew that even dogs got something. And it is a remarkable encounter, because not only does this woman recognize that Jesus is Lord, but she also sees that his love, his compassion, his grace, the compass of God's saving purposes will extend beyond Israel to the Gentiles, to those once considered to be outsiders, to those on the fringe. What happened to her is amazing, and everywhere the gospel is preached, her story is told. For it's a story of someone who probably didn't think they were smart enough or good enough or right enough or religious enough. Someone who might have been frightened of being judged, looked down upon or rejected. Someone who was certainly on the fringes of all this stuff. But she was someone who learnt that Jesus' love and his compassion and his grace extended even to her. So back to those who are on the fringes of our church communities but are wary of closer involvement. The newly de-churched who may be fearful of ever coming back. And the digital fringe, some of whom may be too scared to transfer their virtual engagement into anything more real and lasting. Or maybe they've been hurt or let down in the past and would rather keep their distance. How do we help them to see that God's love, God's compassion, the compass of God's saving purposes extends even to them? Come as you are, we say to them. Come, for you really are welcome. You are accepted and you are loved, not just by me or the church, but by God. Because God's arms are always open wide, always ready to welcome, always ready to embrace. That in his eyes, there are no worthless people. There are no dogs. There are none who simply have to grovel under the table. You are welcome as you are, you are beloved as you are. Amen.